16 kilometers. That was the distance between one of Russia's most important fuel bases and the Russian border. The facility was concealed within what appeared to be an ordinary cement plant near Novomvrosivka in occupied Donetsk Oblast. Its location was not accidental. Russian planners positioned it close enough to the border to ensure a steady flow of supplies by rail while keeping it far from what they believed was any realistic threat. For years, nobody in Moscow believed Ukraine could ever touch it. That perception quickly shattered when Ukraine's first Azov Corps released footage showing the base engulfed in flames after a precision strike. Just a quiet, calculated sequence of strikes that left the base burning and Russia's supply network in occupied Donetsk Oblast scrambling to figure out what to do next. And here's what should genuinely catch your attention before we even get into how it happened. The unit behind this strike carries a name Russia once told the entire world belonged to history. A name Russian officials celebrated as finished, defeated, erased back in 2022. It wasn't finished. And what it just did to a fuel base Russia considered untouchable is only the beginning of a story that keeps getting bigger the deeper you go into it. Here's exactly how this operation actually unfolded, because the method says as much as the result. According to the first Azov Corps, this didn't start with an explosion at all. It started with patience. Drone operators spent time quietly mapping the entire facility first, figuring out how fuel moved through it, where it was stored, and which parts of the system had to fail in order for the whole base to become useless. Only then did the actual strikes begin, and they landed in a specific sequence. First, the railway crane, the one piece of equipment that could have cleared damaged tracks and kept supplies moving. Second, a locomotive, hit at the exact point where it sealed the rail line shut for good. Third, the electrical substation, cutting power to the entire site. And only after all three of those fell, with every backup option already gone, did the fuel tanks themselves finally ignite. The first Azov Corps summed up the importance of this deadly strike with a simple phrase: petroleum products are the blood of war. Adding that Russia had spent years quietly building a network of logistics hubs it genuinely believed were safe from Ukrainian reach. According to Azov, this wasn't just one fuel tank sitting in a field either. That fuel depot functioned as the actual center of Russia's fuel distribution system across occupied Donetsk, receiving petroleum by rail, storing it in both surface tanks and underground reservoirs, then sending it out by tanker trucks disguised to look like ordinary civilian traffic. Now here's the twist that turns this from a single strike into something much bigger. The name Azov should sound familiar, because this is the same unit Russia forced to surrender back in May 2022, after an 86-day siege inside the Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol. Russian officials called that surrender one of their defining victories of the entire war. They designated Azov a terrorist organization. They told the world, repeatedly and confidently, that this unit was gone. It wasn't gone. It grew. By April 2025, the rebuilt force had become the first full Corps-level formation in the history of Ukraine's National Guard. According to Azov's own records, 6 separate brigades strong, with tens of thousands of troops and its own dedicated drone regiment. Commanding it now is Denis Prokopenko, the same officer who led the defense of Mariupol in 2022 and was held in Russian captivity after that surrender, before eventually returning to lead the very corps built out of that defeat. So the unit that just dismantled a hidden fuel base 16 kilometers from Russia's own border is the same one Russia proudly announced it had destroyed, striking in the same region where its predecessor was once forced to lay down its weapons. And this wasn't a one-time strike either. According to Reuters, Azov drones had already been hitting occupied Mariupol itself in the weeks before this operation, targeting the seaport, electrical substations, and repair facilities across the same city where Azov's story was supposed to have ended. Novomvrosivka is simply the newest and most damaging strike in a campaign that has been building steadily, week after week, in exactly the territory Russia once called secured. That pattern is the real story here. This isn't a single dramatic headline built for attention. It's sustained pressure, applied again and again, against a supply system that was never designed to survive this kind of repeated damage. And that leaves one question hanging over everything you've just watched. A strike this precise, hitting a target Russia genuinely believed was out of reach, doesn't happen with ordinary drones or lucky timing. It takes a very specific kind of weapon, one built to fly past jamming and past air defense without ever losing its target. What that weapon actually is, and who is quietly standing behind it, is about to make this entire operation make a lot more sense. The drone behind this strike is called the Hornet, and once you understand how it actually works, the rest of this war starts to make a lot more sense. Every other drone flying over this battlefield depends on one of two things to find its target: either GPS or a live radio signal from a human pilot sitting somewhere far away. Russia has spent years building electronic warfare systems specifically designed to jam both. Cut the signal, and the drone falls out of the sky. Useless. The Hornet doesn't play by that rule. Instead of relying purely on GPS or a constant radio link, it uses a downward-facing camera that continuously films the ground beneath it, tracking terrain features as it flies, the same basic principle used to help guide rovers navigating the surface of Mars. That detail alone is why Russian soldiers on the ground started calling it something else entirely. They nicknamed it Martian 2. When darkness or flat, featureless terrain makes that camera tracking harder, an infrared spotlight kicks in to keep the drone oriented. And in the final stretch of its attack run, an AI-powered targeting system automatically locks onto whatever it's aiming for, even if the pilot's signal has already been completely jammed. Jam the connection all you want. The drone just keeps flying anyway, straight toward its target. The company behind this weapon is called Perennial Autonomy, and it was founded and financed by Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google. Before building drones, Schmidt spent years chairing the Pentagon's Defense Innovation Advisory Board and later led the U.S. National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. Back in 2023, he wrote publicly that the future of war would be dictated and waged by drones. Then he quietly built a company to prove himself right. The first confirmed combat use of the Hornet showed up near Donetsk in March 2026, the exact same month Ukrainian forces were dealing devastating losses to a Russian battalion just outside Pokrovsk, a detail worth remembering, because it comes back into this story very soon. Picture the actual cost difference here for a moment, because it's almost absurd. A single Hornet runs somewhere around $6,000, roughly the price of a used car. And these drones have already been documented striking targets well past 100 kilometers behind Russian lines, with some reporting suggesting a maximum range closer to 200 kilometers in certain configurations. And Ukraine just found a way to stretch that reach even further. According to Defense News, Ukrainian forces have started launching Hornets from high-altitude balloons, letting the wind carry the drone dozens of miles before its own engine ever switches on. That trick alone roughly doubles how deep the weapon can strike into Russian-held territory, all without spending a single extra dollar on the drone itself. A Russian military blogger named Alexander Karchenko admitted the effect of all this plainly on his own Telegram channel. He said, "Patrols that used to move freely 50 kilometers behind the front line are now under direct fire from these drones." Another Russian voice, reviewing recovered Hornet wreckage, described it as an extremely dangerous weapon, difficult to hear coming, invisible to standard detectors, and resistant to jamming, exactly the kind of admission that tells you a weapon is actually working. Russia has tried to fight back against it too, stretching protective netting across major roads to block incoming drones. That failed. A dedicated interceptor drone called the Yoka has managed to shoot a few Hornets down mid-flight, but even that success remains the exception rather than anything close to a reliable defense. And by May 2026, the Hornet had already moved from a Ukrainian battlefield experiment into full NATO doctrine, with the U.S. Army running training exercises with this exact drone in Germany, Poland, and Lithuania, all within the same few weeks. A weapon built specifically to solve Ukraine's problem against Russian jamming had, in a matter of months, become something the entire Western alliance now wants in its own arsenal. A drone this cheap, this hard to stop, purpose-built to hunt fuel and logistics rather than soldiers directly, doesn't just win individual strikes. It starts breaking an army's ability to actually fight at all, and that breakdown is already showing up in places that should genuinely worry you. Here's what all of this actually does to soldiers on the ground, and it's more brutal than any single explosion could ever show you. Ukraine's own defense minister, Mikhailo Fedorov, revealed during a press conference in Kyiv that in parts of the southern front, Russian infantry are now being forced to walk up to 30 kilometers on foot just to reach their own positions, because the vehicles and fuel that used to carry them there have been destroyed. Independent assessments from ISW have separately confirmed fuel rationing and troops conducting logistics on foot in sectors further north as well, suggesting this isn't an isolated complaint. It's a pattern spreading across multiple parts of the front at once. Picture an army that spent years building its entire war around mechanized speed, tanks, trucks, rapid resupply, now reduced to marching soldiers on foot through open countryside, exactly the kind of movement that Ukrainian reconnaissance drones are built to spot instantly. Russian units have gotten inventive, trying to disguise what fuel they do still have left. According to reporting from Ukrainian officials, Russian forces have started hiding fuel inside ordinary grain trucks, covering the containers with tarpaulins and loose grain to make them look like nothing more than agricultural cargo rolling down a rural road. That kind of desperation doesn't stay contained to logistics maps and supply charts either. It shows up directly on the ground, in villages that had been under Russian control for the better part of a year. On July 8th, Ukrainian Marines from the 37th Separate Marine Brigade, working alongside paratroopers from the 79th Air Assault Tavria Brigade, fully liberated a village called Novokatske in Donetsk Oblast, according to a joint statement from the units involved. Russian forces had held that settlement since roughly mid-July 2025, nearly a full year, and Ukrainian troops cleared it despite dense minefields and stubborn resistance every step of the way. Novokatske itself is a small village, home to barely more than 100 people before the war, tucked between the Vovcha River and the Mokry Yali River near the border with Dnipropetrovsk region. That location was never accidental. The river valleys running through it gave Russian forces natural cover to shift troops and shuttle reinforcements along that stretch of the front without Ukrainian eyes catching every movement. Retaking the village closed that corridor and secured a crossing point both sides had relied on for the better part of a year. And Novokatske wasn't an isolated win either. It fit inside a much larger southern offensive that Ukraine's Marine Corps Command has been running since early May 2026, one that pulled in not just the 37th and the 79th, but also the 80th and 95th Brigades, all pushing along the same stretch of front at once. Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky confirmed that since the start of 2026 alone, Ukrainian forces have liberated more than 670 square kilometers of territory. Now, here comes the connection worth pausing on, because this war keeps circling back to the same faces in the strangest ways. That same 79th Brigade wasn't a stranger to this fight either. Back in March 2026, near Pokrovsk, the 79th had already inflicted devastating losses on the 2nd Battalion of Russia's 5th Motorized Rifle Brigade, known as Oplot, damage severe enough that Ukrainian military reporting described that the unit is suffering critical, irreparable losses, forcing Russia to pull it off the front entirely just to rebuild it from scratch. And the history between these two units runs even deeper than that single battle. 12 years earlier, back in 2014 and 2015, soldiers from the 79th Brigade were among the Ukrainian defenders who held Donetsk airport for 242 days against relentless Russian-backed assaults, earning the nickname Cyborgs for refusing to give up the ruins of that airport, no matter how much firepower was thrown at them. The unit they faced in those exact battles was the same 5th Motorized Rifle Brigade, Oplot. Back then, the Cyborgs were eventually forced to retreat. 12 years later, the same paratroopers met the same Russian formation again outside Pokrovsk. This time, Oplot's battalion didn't survive the encounter. That's not a coincidence worth glossing over. It's proof that this war has a memory, and that some of these units have been settling the same unfinished fight for over a decade. All of this pressure, the burning fuel depots, the soldiers walking instead of driving, the villages falling one by one, had to show up somewhere bigger eventually. And on July 8th, it did, in the last place Russia wanted the world watching, its own national economy. That same day, Russia's Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak announced, in a televised government meeting chaired directly by Vladimir Putin, that Russia was banning diesel fuel exports completely, extending an earlier partial ban to cover every producer in the country. Novak said the government would also begin importing fuel from other nations that same month, just to keep the domestic market stable. It's almost hard to believe. One of the largest energy exporting nations on the entire planet, A country that built decades of political power on selling fuel to the rest of the world was now telling its own producers they weren't allowed to sell it and arranging to buy fuel from abroad instead. And here's the detail that turns this from an economic footnote into a genuine admission. At that exact same meeting, Putin himself downplayed the entire crisis publicly, telling the room that Ukraine was clearly trying to damage Russia's economy and create a sense of anxiety inside Russian society, before adding that this goal was, in his words, unattainable because Russia's economic resilience remained among the highest in the world. He said that while ordinary Russians were lining up for hours outside gas stations in cities across the country, CNN's own independent analysis, published the same week, found that nearly all of Russia's 83 federal regions had experienced gasoline shortages or supply disruptions of some kind. Not a handful of struggling provinces, nearly the entire country, simultaneously. The raw numbers behind that collapse are staggering once you actually look at them. Russia's diesel exports had already fallen by roughly 39% in a single month compared to May, and by nearly 46% compared to the same period the year before, according to shipping data cited by Reuters. Russia's crude oil processing had dropped to its lowest level in more than 2 decades, and two of Russia's biggest diesel customers on the global market, Turkey and Brazil, which together had been absorbing at least half of every available Russian diesel cargo, were suddenly left scrambling for alternative suppliers. Global diesel prices didn't just notice. Benchmark European diesel margins jumped to a record high the very day the export ban was announced. A fuel depot burning behind a cement plant in occupied Donetsk had somehow turned into a number moving on international commodity screens within a matter of days. And the ripple effects kept spreading into places that had nothing to do with fuel at all. Russia temporarily halted shipping through the Don-Azov Canal, the waterway connecting the Don River to the Sea of Azov, a decision that industry sources told Reuters could affect close to a quarter of all Russian wheat exports moving through that region. An oil and gas superpower was now watching its own grain shipments get tangled up in the same crisis. Even Russia's own central bank couldn't fully paper over what was happening. Deputy Governor Alexei Zabatkin acknowledged to reporters that months of the fuel sector operating below full capacity would, in his own words, probably take something out of this year's GDP results, a rare, understated admission from inside Russia's own financial institutions that the damage wasn't just a battlefield story anymore. A president publicly dismissing the pressure while his own country rations gasoline in nearly every region, while his own central bank quietly admits the damage to GDP. That's not the picture of a nation absorbing a temporary setback. That's the picture of a government trying to manage a crisis it can no longer fully hide. And Ukraine's answer to all of this wasn't just to keep striking harder, it was to change the entire structure behind the strikes. 2 days after that diesel ban, Ukraine made its own move, and it wasn't another strike. It was a structural one. On July 10th, President Volodymyr Zelensky signed a decree creating a brand new long-range strike command inside Ukraine's armed forces. In his own words, Zelensky described it as a command focused on long-range, effectively global impact against Russia for the remainder of this war, one built to concentrate 100% of available resources specifically on reducing Russia's ability to keep fighting. Notice what that actually means. Every strike you've just watched unfold across this story, the fuel depots, the logistics hubs, the refineries, had until now largely depended on individual units like Azov acting on their own initiative, coordinating where they could, but essentially improvising a nationwide campaign, one operation at a time. Zelensky just turned that improvisation into permanent military doctrine, with dedicated command authority behind it. In that same address, he announced a second new formation as well, the Joint Rapid Reaction Forces, a unit built to merge assault troops, drone systems, and artillery into a single, fast-reacting branch of the military. Leading it is Brigadier General Dmytro Voloshin, a hero of Ukraine and the current commander of the 8th Air Assault Corps, chosen specifically, according to Zelensky, for his direct combat experience on the front line rather than a background running things from behind a desk. An honest telling of this story has to stop here and ask the harder question, because celebrating too early would be dishonest. Is this genuinely a sign of Ukrainian strength? Or is it also a quiet admission that the current pace couldn't be sustained without deeper institutional support behind it? Realistically, it's both. Zelensky himself has openly acknowledged that Ukraine still faces a serious shortage of air defense systems, calling it Russia's one remaining significant advantage in this entire war. Russia, for its part, hasn't simply given up either. It's actively adapting, building new rail lines through occupied southern territory, developing alternative resupply routes further from the front, and importing gasoline from India and Belarus, with Belarusian fuel imports reportedly reaching a monthly record in June alone, according to Ukrainian reporting. So this isn't a finished war, and it isn't a clean, uncomplicated victory, but look at where the actual numbers now sit. According to ISW's own tracking, Russia's rate of territorial advance in Donetsk has collapsed by roughly 72% compared to the same period last year, dropping from over 2,000 square kilometers seized in the first half of 2025 to just a few hundred square kilometers in the same months of 2026. In June alone, Russia's entire net territorial gain amounted to just 30 square kilometers, compared to more than 400 square kilometers a month back in 2025. That's not a coincidence sitting next to everything else you've just watched unfold. That's the direct, measurable result of it. An army that has to walk instead of drive, refineries that can't keep pace with demand, a government publicly rationing the very fuel it built its global influence on selling, doesn't advance the way it used to, no matter how many soldiers it still has left to send forward. Zelensky made one further claim in that same address worth mentioning, honestly rather than accepting at face value. He suggested that inside Russia's own political elite, there's a growing recognition that peace has no real alternative left. Reuters' own reporting from that same week tells a very different story, citing sources who say Putin is actually rejecting calls to negotiate, and that the strikes, if anything, are hardening his resolve rather than softening it. Two very different readings of the same moment, and worth remembering that neither side gets to write the ending of this war just by saying it out loud first. What isn't up for debate is the pattern sitting underneath all of it. A unit Russia once proudly declared destroyed just dismantled one of its most protected fuel networks in 4 calculated moves. A weapon built by a Silicon Valley billionaire is now flying past Russian, jamming almost at will. Villages held for a year are falling. And a government that spent decades selling fuel to the entire world is now rationing it at home while publicly pretending the pressure doesn't exist. Whatever comes next in Donetsk, it isn't going to be decided by who has more soldiers left to send into the fight. It's going to be decided by who still has the fuel left to move them there in the first place. So here's the question worth sitting with. Russia still has more soldiers to send forward than Ukraine has drones to stop them. Can a fuel crisis alone win a war of attrition, or does Ukraine eventually need something more than logistics pressure? Drop your answer in the comments. This is the Frontline Show. If you want to see how Russia's supply routes came under renewed pressure after Ukraine struck 2 key bridges in occupied territory, click the video on your screen and watch the full breakdown.